Hello, welcome to week 3. I mentioned last week that this is not a grammar course really, but that we are going to review some grammar just because I think most people need a little bit of a refresher. And some of the journal writing that I saw this past week does reflect some mechanical issues that some people need to take care of. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to give you the shortest possible guide to sentence structure. And I think the first thing that we probably would want to ask is, what is a sentence? Well, there are actually 3 elements that are needed to make a good grammatical sentence. Does anybody know what they are? Well, first is a subject, of course. Next is a verb. And finally, a sentence has to express a complete thought. A sentence does not have to have an object. And I suppose the shortest sentence in the English language is one that doesn't have either a subject or an object. Now, I just said every sentence has to have a subject. So I am contradicting myself in a way, but in commands, when we give commands or we tell someone to do something, we normally would not necessarily use the word you as a subject. In other words, do this. You could say do this, or you could say you do this, but often we leave out the you in commands so that we call that you understood. In other words, everybody understands that you're looking at a person and you're speaking to the person, and the subject of that sentence is you. So the shortest possible sentence grammatically correct in the English language, I suppose, would be go. And that is a sentence because it has a subject, it has a verb, and it has a complete thought. Now, the complete thought part of this is what I think sometimes may get people a little bit confused. When I say complete thought, it doesn't mean that it leaves the audience, the person spoken to, with every bit of information needed to be known about the subject. It simply means that it can stand by itself as a logical and complete unit. So those are the 3 elements, and there's an example of a very short but correct sentence. The subject being sentence errors, the verb being are, which is a linking verb, and common is the complement to the linking verb. So, in order to know about sentences and sentence types, it's important to know about clauses. So let's look at what constitutes a clause. Okay, you've heard about the Santa Claus, for example. If you think about the title of that movie, there is an E on the end, so it's a play on the grammatical term clause, often used in a legal sense. So a clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a verb. Now, you might say, how is that any different from a sentence then? Well, the answer is it doesn't necessarily have to have that third element, because it does not have to express a complete thought and be able to stand by itself. And that's because there are 2 types of clauses, just 2. One is dependent. Well, we should naturally start with the independent. One is independent, and then obviously the other is dependent. Independent means just what it says. It can stand by itself as a complete thought. It does not rely on anything outside of the sentence to complete its meaning. So, I went is a complete thought. Okay, now, don't start thinking, well, you didn't tell me where you went, so it's not complete, because if I told you where I went, and then you'd say, well, when did you go? And we could go on and on with that. It's just that it can stand by itself. It doesn't need something else, as the next example does, which is a dependent clause. So, the group of words since I went is more than the independent clause in terms of word count, but it's less in terms of being able to stand by itself, because that word since makes it dependent on something else to complete the meaning. So this is the difference between the 2 types of clauses. It's all in that question of whether or not the thought is complete or whether it needs to be completed, usually by being linked to an independent clause. So the independent clause and the dependent clause go together in certain types of sentences. So you see the examples there, and the independent clause must be attached to a dependent clause in order to make it. Well, the other way around. A dependent clause must be attached to an independent clause in order to make a complete thought. Sometimes other words or other terms are used for clauses. Independent is equivalent to main clause, if you see that term, the main clause. And subordinate is another term for the dependent clause. Those terms are interchangeable. I want to look at some common sentence errors. Again, I saw some of these in the journals, and as I remarked to the students when I saw them, don't worry too much about it. That's what we're here to fix. Now, one error is a fragment, and that's on one extreme. Something's missing. In a fragment, it's usually it could be a subject, it could be a verb, or it could be the fact that the group of words has a subject and a verb but doesn't express a complete thought. So, I missed class, period, because I was sick. In that example, because I was sick is a fragment because it does not express a complete thought. So, if you dress up a dependent clause with a capital letter at the beginning and a period at the end, it's called a fragment. And fragments usually, or I would say many fragments, I couldn't give you the approximate percentage, but an awful lot of fragments occur because we put in a period where it doesn't belong. So that fragment can be fixed simply by taking out the period and making the be and because lowercase so as to make the whole thing one sentence, to link together the independent and the dependent clauses. Sometimes, however, the period will go in there and just create a fragment, which is simply a phrase. So my paper had a fragment, period, in the first paragraph, period. Well, what looks like the second sentence there is a fragment because it really is just a prepositional phrase. It does not have any subject, and it doesn't have any verb, and it doesn't express a complete thought. It is nothing more than a prepositional phrase, and we don't normally punctuate them as sentences. Fragments often begin with those subordinating conjunctions like the one because we see in the first example there. And it's helpful, I think, because definitions sometimes elude us. It can be more helpful to just be familiar with some of the common subordinating conjunctions. Those are kind of flags. If you're a person who tends to write fragments or to create fragments in your writing, to use these subordinating conjunctions as a kind of red flag. Look for them in your writing and just make sure that you did not create a fragment. Although, because, since, when, where, and if are some of the major ones. And on the next slide I'm going to show you is a more complete list, and this is pretty exhaustive. So there aren't thousands of subordinating conjunctions. There are only approximately this many. I'm not going to read this, but if you want to come back to this presentation at some point and take a look at the full list, or go again to your go-to resource, the Little Seagull Handbook. Every grammar book has lists of subordinating conjunctions. Common sentence error number 2 is the run-on. Now, again, there are misconceptions about what constitutes a run-on. If you ask most people, I think they would say a run-on is a sentence that just goes on and on. And that's a very untechnical and really inaccurate definition. And the point here is that a sentence can be very long and completely correct, can also be relatively short, and it can be a run-on. Run-ons are not defined by length. They're not just overly long sentences. Run-on can be defined as two independent clauses that are not properly joined. There are a number of ways to fix run-ons, but we won't look at that right now. We'll just think about the fact that it's two sentences that are just jammed together into one without any proper connection between them. And here's an example. I wrote the paper. It took me 4 hours. Now, you can obviously see there that there are two independent clauses. One, I wrote the paper, and two, it took me 4 hours. So we can, as I said, resolve this in a number of ways. One way you can always fix a run-on is to put a period in between the two independent clauses. Now, that's not always the best way because it results in short sentences, and you don't always want a lot of really short sentences. So you want to look also at some of the other ways that we have to correct run-ons. Now, a comma splice could be called a form of a run-on. And I would guess, no, I wouldn't guess. I will state that a comma splice is the most common form of sentence error in student writing. And a comma splice is defined it is similar to a run-on. It's two independent clauses joined together, but it's not that there's nothing joining them, it's that there's a comma joining them. Okay? You cannot use a comma to join two independent clauses. That is called a comma splice. The word splice meaning to join together. So it's improperly joining together the two independent clauses. And here's an example and something you might very well write. I took the test, comma, I got an A. Well, grammatically speaking, those are two independent clauses. You have a subject and a verb in the first clause, I and took. You have a subject and a verb in the second clause, I and got, and each can stand by itself. You can put a period in there and you have fixed the comma splice. Now, if in your first journal I noted that you had a problem with comma splices, now's the time to go to the Little Seagull Handbook and look at some of the examples given there of comma splices, the explanation to reinforce my own explanation, and also to get some practice really on recognizing these. So it can be a habit that can be difficult to break, but if you're aware of it and you proofread your essays and your journals for the particular problem that you have a pattern with, then you will be able to correct it. Now, a couple of important things to remember. Again, first of all, a very long sentence can be grammatically correct. There is really a trio of great writers, great American writers of the 20th century. There is Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, Hemingway and Faulkner were sort of diametrically opposite in terms of their styles. Faulkner was sometimes known to write sentences that went on for pages. Hemingway, on the other hand, was known for his very short, crisp style, short sentences. If you read The Old Man and the Sea, it's a good example of the Hemingway style. Hemingway's style is often parodied, and there's even a competition, or there was, I'm not sure it still exists, there's competition every year to write the funniest parody of Hemingway's style. So it's not a matter of sentence length, it's a matter of structure. A very short sentence can be a run-on, and a very long sentence can sometimes be a fragment. Now, fragments can sometimes, I stress sometimes, be used effectively. They can be used effectively. Now, that doesn't throw the rule out the window, and you can just use it if you want to anytime. It's very clear to a reader when a fragment is used because the writer does not know what he or she is doing, and a fragment that's placed there to be effective. Sometimes it's the repetition. You write a sentence. It was the most important day of my life, period. The most important, period. Okay. The second part of that is a fragment, the second sentence, because it doesn't have a verb, doesn't express a complete thought. But it is effective there as a repetition and a way of emphasizing the point. So if you do use fragments, make sure, it's like the old saying, you have to know the rules before you can break them. Let's look now at types of sentences real quickly. We really have three. Okay, we have the simple sentence, which is one independent clause. We said an independent clause can always serve as a sentence because it has the three elements and it can stand by itself. Then we have compound sentences. Okay, those are two or more independent clauses joined by either a semicolon, which is a proper way of joining two independent clauses, or a coordinating conjunction such as and, or, but, yet, and so. Okay, so it's not just a comma in a compound sentence. It's got to be a comma and a coordinating conjunction. That's the difference between a correct sentence and a comma splice. And thirdly, we have a complex sentence which has at least one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. Some grammarians will also add the compound complex sentence, which is a combination of all three types, really. I don't consider that to be a separate type of sentence. It's just a bit. It's a bigger structure. That's all it is, but it's still building with the same building blocks. In your writing, you want to mix it up a little bit. Use a variety of sentences. You don't want to have all simple sentences. You don't want to have all long sentences. You want to break it up sometimes. That's really a matter of style rather than grammatical correctness. And we'll talk about style really at the very end of the course because that's kind of the icing on the cake. And many of us are not there yet in terms of looking at stylistic elements. So that's it for now. We got a couple of other things to do. So I will see you in a couple more videos this week.